live. We'll give people some time to connect. And are you able to see the chat, or is it
Uh,
just
I,
me?
s- I think I can.
Okay. Okay. So we'll both keep an eye on the chat, and we've got some people joining right now. And I'm really glad that folks are tuning in. I am corresponding from Cork, Ireland right now, doing research on my next book around belonging and freedom, food, art, and ritual. But this book that has just come out is something that I'm interested in because I'm interested in our practices.
Mm,
And I'm wondering, brother, if you could just introduce yourself to the folks who are joining and the folks who will watch this later, and let us know this new book that has literally just dropped.
yeah. Well, thank you, Roberto, for inviting me into this space. I remember our conversation year, 2 years maybe now about some of the practices that you were living out, and to hear that there is now a book creation around that, that's really neat. So, likewise, I can't wait to read that book. You're right, this one just came out. It's Whole and Human. Oh, it's backwards. I don't know how to make it not backwards. But um, a collection of meditations for liberating body and spirit, which is to say, a collection of meditations that are probably the antithesis of many church traditions or formation that those who have been attached to contemporary church traditions have either endured or practiced. So I'm trying to offer a difference. I'm trying to offer pathways that usually counter a lot of the practices that we have come to either hold dear or reject in church traditions, or spiritual traditions. And so we can chat about what those primary pillars are. But yeah, it's here. It's out in the world, so wherever books are sold.
Can't wait to get my copy. I'm still waiting on my copy, but I'm not going to be home for yet a couple of weeks. And so I will check the mailbox when I'm home. Now, one of the things that I'm interested in is, you know, I learned, let me just give you some context on this. I gave a talk in Zurich, Switzerland on my first book, Activist Theology. And what I learned in that conference is that every ideology, what scholars call ideology, or what we might call worldview, is rooted in othering. And your book is titled Whole and Human. And in a world that has accelerated polarization, how might some of these practices help us return to ourselves so that we can be whole and human?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I think it calls us into the heart of the matter that is in front of us, which is to say, I believe we have a distorted worldview, and many of us are clamoring for ways to find our whole self. And we are reaching into places that offer an illusion of our humanity. And too many of us are being swayed, untethered in cultural forces or culture wars,
Mhm.
where it's leaving us incomplete and untethered. And so this is actually going to be my next book, or the hope is my next book about being untethered to, um, or trying to tether ourselves to shallow places. And so the way Whole and Human shows up in this moment is that it starts to offer previews of substance where we can establish roots into bedrock versus being shaped and formed in malformed places. And so, for example, the tethers that I allude to in the book, one of them is land. And so there's a reorientation of land that needs to happen in our worldview where we become not merely caretakers of the land, but we seek to repair broken relationship with the land. And we don't, especially in the West, consider land as something to hold relationship to. But if we appeal to indigenous wisdom, we displace the notions that land is merely commodity or land is something to be exploited, and we replace it with with reciprocity, where land is something that not only sustains us, but can provide us with a tether for identity, um, identity to place, identity to worldview. And so land is one of those components of a decolonial nature that is posturing our existence in a completely different way that doesn't seek to race to the bottom of consumption, which is sort
Mm,
of this capitalist ideal, and instead offers us the possibilities of sustainability. And when we start to consider how the one next to us alongside our own bodies can be sustained in a good way, we start to elaborate on the potential of wholeness, of what wholeness might look like, and the liberation of our bodies, not just my body and how it can reach the top, but how we can collectively pursue the possibilities of freedom and liberation. Um, and so decolonization or decolonial worldviews, that's one of the pathways. So that's land, and the other pathways, and we could spend like hours on this, but the other pathways surround postures of justice. And then I think another one, tether wise, is finding our people. And so an identity rather than rooted in, say, cultural assumptions such as racialization, so whiteness, rather than rooting our identities in the power or privileges of, say, whiteness if you're white, or being adjacent to whiteness, we try to appeal back to the ethnicities of our ancestors. And so that serves as a tether for our identities, replacing racialization, which is just a made up cultural assumption, with the stories, beliefs, practices of our ancestors, which might have to go back quite far. But that's not new to anybody to go and appeal back to your ancestry. But to earnestly seek that in these times, I think is an important tether for us to reestablish so we can find some anchors. And so
mhm.
that's partially where the book is situated, but that's where really my next book is going. But I still offer previews and practices for those tethers in Whole and Human.
Yeah. Yeah, I have always been a critic of the neoliberal world that disconnects us from our root system. And I make my home in rural New York, where I think, like many people, people are disconnected from the land.
Yeah,
And as I have traveled in Europe for this entire month, it's a very different orientation to land in Europe. I mean, the same colonial problems exist and the imperial project is here, but there is a different relationship to land when I am in the north of Ireland or in the Republic. And I think we can learn some things from our Irish siblings, our European siblings that are trying to recover roots. I'll never forget one of my intellectual partners told me that I was disconnected from my roots. My family comes from Oaxaca, Mexico. I grew up in Texas, and my schooling has taken me really all over the United States, and I have not really been rooted. And now that I am in rural New York, I am trying to get to know that land, and that is a counter hegemonic practice
Mhm.
because people are not trying to get reconnected to land. People are trying
Mhm.
to consume.
Yeah.
People are trying to build homes, and there's not a turn toward the land. I see that my buddy Ryan Cagle is on, and he just picked a bunch of onions and potatoes and blackberries, getting his hands dirty in his land, and he said he felt whole from that from that practice
Mm.
of actually growing food. What do you see in your community or in the people that are nurturing this kind of return to land? What are you hearing from people who say, "Yeah, this is the way to go. This is the right turn"?
Yeah, I think there are different facets, and I think this actually appeals back to longings that make us more human. Well, we can't be any more human than we are right now, but we can unlock these aspects of our humanity that are yearning to touch dirt, you know, and so many of us have discovered what it means to touch dirt, to touch grass. Um, it looks a little bit different, I think, in the city where you were left with just little glimpses of what getting your hands dirty in the dirt can look like. It's harder to establish connection into land when it's parceled out, when it's been tilled, when there's grass everywhere, invasive species of grass. Um, and so I think many of us understand because it is innate in us what the longing to be immersed in the renewal, rejuvenation, the death and decay of the land. And then I think there's a deeper level of appealing back to the knowledge keepers of the land where our feet touch. And I think it's very important for us to be attentive as settlers, as immigrants to the lands that we are guests on, that we're new on, to appeal to the knowledge keepers, the indigenous knowledge keepers of the memories that the land
Mm,
holds. Because the land has distant, long held memory and knows the stories from before we were here. It is retaining stories over millennia, and we need to find ourselves connected to that rich texture and history. And we can only do so when we immerse ourselves at the seat and at the teachings of those indigenous folks and storytellers who are alerting us to a different way of being. And so when we touch grass, when we touch dirt, we are, I think, unlocking or appealing to some innate understanding in our humanity to be connected to land and tethered to land in place. And I also think that there is an honoring that must happen where we are also alert to the stories of the original inhabitants of the lands. That also helps us, I think, appreciate the tethers back to our ancestors again, to use that, to go back to that, because when we see folks who say, "Oh, I'm white," but really, if you were to dig into that, who are your ancestors? Like, oh, maybe have that Irish ancestry, and you can then appeal back to, let's just use Ireland as an example, your Irish ancestry, and perhaps learn how they situated themselves and held practices that cared for and related to the land back in Ireland. And
right.
that offers us a tether to inform how we show up in the world today in the places where we are situated. And so, what it looks like to show up in a good way in the world today as a counter to culture and culture wars really must extend back to the wisdom of the ancestors and the traditional indigenous knowledge keepers. And that is all tethered to land. And so it's a total juxtaposition compared to how most of us are shaped and formed to understand relationship to land, which is, like I said, off the hop, exploitive. It is meant to be used. It's meant to be profited, capitalized on. And I don't think that leads us into a life-sustaining place.
Mm. Yeah, I'm struck by the inherent um nature of networking with land, that it is a place to be in relationship with and not a place to extract or exploit. We're
Yeah.
not taught this.
Hmm.
In the United States, we are not taught to be in relationship with land. And now living on Haudenosaunee land of the Seneca people, I'm learning what that knowledge is. You know, there are burial grounds near where I live, there are celebration sites near where I live. And these places, these pieces of land were nurtured for ritual. And
Hmm.
we've
Hmm.
virtually seen ritual disappear from our landscape. And certainly land is not being used for ritual. And so I just feel very curious how some of these practices might help us turn away from the bullshit and turn toward liberation, turn toward another possible world, etc.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, so I have some in the book, and I actually tell some stories, or I reiterate some stories about the juxtaposition of how we treat land. And I live on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary in Canada, and that is the homeland of the Tsuut'ina, the Blackfoot Confederacy, and the Stoney Nakoda, and it's also the Métis um, people, Region 5. So that's Treaty 7. And just west is where Banff is, or the Rocky Mountains. And I remember a story that I tell of showing up around summer solstice and what the recovery of a ritual, as you have said, and how the medicines from the land have actually eroded. They have been displaced, some eliminated, because the reserve, which is west of Calgary, the Stoney Nakoda Reserve, or it's called Morley or Minitni today, is a recovery of the traditional name. The um, the the land and the medicines don't exist because just slightly west of the reserve lies a gravel plant that's cleaving off sides of the mountain and has been there for over a century. And just downwind is the reserve of it. And the reality of that is the elimination of practices and medicines that have been important to the Stoney Nakoda people. Uh, and so when we were there was a recovery or storytelling of the recovery of some of those practices. And since it was around summer solstice, it was about the recovery of tradition. And when you learn about the rich history of that area, you realize that the process of recovery from a peoples that have been systemically annihilated culturally and also as a people, the the work to recover, starting around the 1960s into the 70s, 80s, has in fact produced a lot of contemporary monuments and days in at least Canadian, but also American um, dates. So, for example, the Indigenous Peoples Day, the counter to a government paper called the White Paper. So the counter was the Red Papers. These were established because of the relationships that were built in the process of recovering ritual informed by practices that were land-based for, and this is all for the indigenous folks that came to uh, both coalesce, recover, and collaborate. A lot of liberating factors uh, emanated from a land just west of this place, and very few people actually know about those stories. And so I think this is why it is important to not merely understand history, but to immerse yourself in land-based education because it starts to reframe your world and worldview. And from that, it informs how you show up in the present.
Yeah, and then shapes values and habits and eventually our practices.
Yeah, exactly. And so I suggest different some of them are very simple practices of becoming more alert to land-based markers in your area or in your the regular place you go for a walk or go for a roll or drive to, or the park that you visit, or the place that you go hike, and just to become more attentive to what you see around you, how you can listen, how you can breathe deeply and coalesce your breath with the breath of creation. These are just simple things that we can practice as mechanisms or really land invitations for us to become embedded with the heartbeat of the land.
Yeah. Why I'm excited to get my copy of the book and to try to turn to more holistic practices that could help me regenerate relationship with the more than human world.
Mm,
Land, for example, and, you know, nature. I my research question for this ethnographic research that I'm doing, um, is about turning toward one another, and a therapist and poet said, "What can we learn from nature?" And, so many of our practices, um, are exploitative of nature. They don't honor nature. I mean, I just was at the Gara here in outside of Cork. That's a wooded wetland that was flooded in the '50s to create dams to electrify
mm,
Ireland, because in the '50s, Ireland was still without electricity and running water. And so they flooded a sacred site, and they thought it was a genius thing to do. But, for those for whom the place, the land was sacred, it was not genius to do. Um, and, I'm just thinking about how the divide and conquer mentality of the Imperial Project has disconnected us from land, has disconnected us from the natural world. And as a result, so many of our practices, spiritual practices, religious practices, and cultural practices have accelerated a division from the natural world.
mhm,
And
yeah.
many of our institutions do the same thing. Yeah, how do we become human with one another? How do we become whole? I think that's a question that many people are asking.
Yeah, and when you look at, let's just pick like the Christian tradition, for example, but in the manner that it has resorted to bringing the faithful into the sterile box house every week, and it's considered to be the epitome of the center of community expression. But if you were to say, "Oh, I'm going to have church in the wilderness this week," or "I have my church in the trees," or what, it's scoffed at because the very height of the Christian practice is to show up on Sunday. And I was in that long, long time ago, 25, 30 years ago. I was in that and would have been the dude to say like, "Oh, you can't have church out in the trees." And now you pivot and say, "Wait a minute. The creator can be encountered in deeply visceral ways when you pause to just listen in the trees." And there are spiritual practices that I think we need to recover, and in the process, we recover our humanity, I think, simply because we become more attuned to creation. And in that attunement, somehow we become also more attuned to our own selves, our own
Mm.
bodies. It's almost like, and I'm not using this word with with any additional context to it, although there is, but to have resonance with creation and body, there's a connection there that is worthy to be discovered and rediscovered and rediscovered, and I share stories about that of how we the, the land is so open and open to our um, both our destruction and also our call for forgiveness. I tell stories about how if we wish to just pause and be attentive, what amazing things can happen when we're immersed in nature. One story of I like to hike up mountains, and one scramble, I reached the top. It was really tough. It was a mountain I hadn't climbed before. I was unable to do it. I missed it twice, and on the third time managed to make it to the top. And when you're at the top of the world, it seems, it's very quiet other than distant wind, and you don't hear anything, and you might see the odd plane in the distance, but it's eerily quiet. And I have a practice of just offering prayer at the top and bottom, but when I reach a summit, and when I was there, it was just simple words of listening. Lord, Lord, speak to me. And in that moment, when I opened my eyes, I was stunned to find I was not alone on the top of the mountain anymore. I was sitting next to a raven that had quietly arrived next to me. And I, I'm not adding any additional meaning to that moment. Other than to say that when we pause, listen, and ask the Creator to encounter us in creation, we shouldn't be surprised when our prayers are answered. When our prayers can be examples of screaming all of your problems into the woods so no one else can hear other than creation, that is both cathartic but a spiritual practice that I think we can adopt in our meanderings through the woods. Um, so the land absorbs that, and in return, we receive not only sustenance, literally, but a sense of relief from that connection if we are attuned and attentive to those possibilities. So yeah, there are just so many deeper places that we can unlock if we choose to be open to these possibilities of reconciling or restoring our relationship with land.
Yeah, it reminds me that, there are many scholars who talk about humanity being nature, and we are composed of the natural world. And for many of us, we don't have a way of reconciling ourselves to the natural world.
Mm.
I mean, we don't even know how to talk about death and dying in the
Yeah,
United States or
yeah.
in the
Woo.
West.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a loss of see, like how we struggle so much to show up as human. Like we are lost, and
Mhm.
it's showing up in the way we show up
Yeah.
in snap violence and dehumanization.
Mhm.
Like these things are connected
Yes.
deeply and profoundly.
So, I think this is a book that we should pick up and consider the practices, and I mean, I'm a big believer, I mean, trained as an ethicist, I'm a big believer in practices. We
Mm.
need practices to restore ourselves and our communities, and so can you share with us a few practices that you think,
Yeah,
we should prioritize?
yeah, yeah. Thanks for asking. So the three pillars that I engage with in the book, and I meander between them, but the intentionality behind it is to engage the five senses because I want to counter a lot of formation in religion, in religious communities, and many, particularly Christian, that's who I interrogate the most or at all. Um, the Christian community or thought in theology dehumanizes us in the sense that it casts great suspicion on the body. It does not know how to revere the body. It does not know how to hold the body as this beautiful image bearing its beautiful image bearing qualities. And so I'm attempting to go in the opposite direction and in so doing invite readers into practices that engage the senses, so engage the body. So the pillars that I mentioned, decolonization, justice, and embodiment. And the embodied factors are the aspects of calling us back into the place we ought to belong because it's the first place where we find both our belonging and our liberation. Many of us have been told to a distorted ideas about our bodies and we have dissociated from our bodies. We have considered our bodies profane, sinful. We assume we're going to leave this body for heaven in the clouds in the Christian some Christian traditions, which is not orthodox. We in fact have a belief of the resurrection of the body, that the body will be made into a new body. And so I invite readers to find and capture new or renewed, many of these are not actually new, practices around body. And the simple ones are just becoming more attuned to your body. So in body scans, so this is a process of just trying to bring your attention to your bodies and then working up your body from your toes into your head and being alert to the places that are uncomfortable, places that are in pain, places that are feeling free, knowing that some folks still feel unsafe in their bodies. And so there's still pathways for folks who are like, oh, like I can't really be attentive to my body because I feel unsafe in it. Um, Trying to encounter folks across the spectrums to invite to wherever it is along and it's not linear, but along the spectrum of engaging a deeper level of embodiment, to find that next step, deeper
Mhm.
piece of embodiment towards ultimately being at home in your body, and finding, because there's where your wholeness and liberation is found. So attunement is one of them. I invite folks into um, touch practices. This one you will like. There's a couple of chapters around food, and so that's engaging taste. And to say, not only is there a taste factor here, but that's also an appeal back to the foods of your ancestors. That's a
Mhm.
possibility as well. And so those are just some glimpses. of simple practices of and I'm assuming that many folks actually are starting from the beginning or starting from grade 1 of trying to build embodied practices that surround both their spirituality and their humanity, which are tied together, of course. But there's a lot of work to do to undo the formation that Christians specifically have around uh, our idea and theology of body. I
Mm.
mean, you know all about this.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
So, tell us, where can we pick up this book and where should we buy from? Because we know that the big box stores are compromised with neoliberal capitalism.
Mhm.
You're in Canada, so where can folks get your book? Should we buy it from the publisher or where should we
Yeah.
shop?
I mean, you can buy it anywhere books are sold. I mean, I'm not gonna tell folks they have to go through a particular avenue. It doesn't matter to me in terms of royalty. But yeah, of course, I hate the big box stores and they're killing us and killing the earth. Um, you can order it from me, but you can order it from the publisher, Menno Media or Herald Press. That works too. That's direct from them. But ultimately, any independent bookstore is able to bring it in, and I love me an independent bookstore.
Yeah,
So that's another space.
yeah. Well, I'll put that in the links with a link to the book and
Yeah.
um I know there's some I think it's bookshop or
Hmm.
so I'll
Any of
make
those
sure
will
that I
have it. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, good. I'm glad that we had this conversation.
Thank
I
you.
didn't want to wait till mid-June when I was home in the States to give this a bump. I think this is a book that we probably need to pick up and consider and begin returning to practices and returning to pillars
Mm.
that are liberative instead of pillars that are dominating
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
colonizing us.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. And I think it's accessible for folks. It's attentive to varying needs and where you're at on the journey. But it is a counter, you know. I spend the first 5 chapters countering some pretty substantive pillars in Christian theology and tradition, like
But it
sin.
needs to be done. We need the
Yeah, it's
counter.
hard
We need
to
the pushback.
yeah, yeah, that's just not popular. Like devotionals, meditations, they're hot. They're hot, right? But the ones that are hot, they don't really say anything in particular. They don't
Right.
stand for something. And as soon as you enter the realm of standing for something, you know about this, suddenly you're pushed to the fringes of obscurity. And so there's always this balance of trying to name and and speak truth, be a truth teller in the realm of mediocrity. So
Yeah. Yeah. In the realm of mediocrity.
dang.
Well, thank you, brother, for telling us about your book
Oh, the pleasure's all mine. Thank
and
you for
giving us a
opening
little
your home.
preview. Yeah.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Yeah, it's always fun to chat with you and let's do it again.
All right. Take good care. Thanks so much for joining us,
Yes,
folks.
thanks folks.
Go get the book. It's worth it. Can't wait to get my hands on my copy. Y'all take
Yeah,
good care.
thank you.